back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I am doing another one of the 12 Days of Christmas videos. We are drawing to the end of the 12 Days of Christmas with only a couple of days left, and today I am doing a video that was suggested by one of you. The video suggestion was for me to look at a list of must-read classics and see how many of them I had read. I actually kind of had a difficult time with this because I was looking at different lists and some of them were just not great lists. So there was one that was from Penguin and they were all books that were just recommended by random people, which didn't feel like as official of a list. And then Barnes and Noble had one, but it was, I think 50 books you should read before you die or something like that. And it had all 7 of the Harry Potter books on there. I have no issue with Harry Potter. But I was like, this is a list of only 50 books, and you literally took a fifth of the list, almost entirely a fifth of the list for one series when you could have just made that one slot and said you should read Harry Potter. So I decided not to do that one. I found a list that is on Forbes that is the 30 best classic novels everyone should read. I'll link the article in the description in case you want to take a look for yourself. But because it's Forbes, it feels a bit more official, and it's one that says classic novels because that was what was suggested. Sometimes when it's books you must read before you die, there might be some that just came out last year. And so I wanted to make sure I was doing one that was specifically classic literature. Okay, so let's see how we do here. Number 30 is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. I actually have not read this. This was on my classics TBR 2 years ago and I didn't get to it. So it's still on my shelves and I haven't read it. Number 29 is Native Son by Richard Wright. I actually do not have this either, have not read it. I haven't read any Richard Wright, so we are not off to a great start. Next we have Roots by Alex Haley. I've heard of the miniseries, but I actually didn't even know that it was based on a book. So yet another one that I have not read. This one's certainly more of a modern classic, which I guess Things Fall Apart might be considered as well, and maybe Native Son because those were published in the 40s or 50s. But Roots was published in 1976, so it's not even quite 50 years old yet. Next we have number 27, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey, which was published in 1962. So again, a modern classic, another one that I have not read, but I've seen parts of the movie. Finally, number 26, a book I have read, The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, which is also probably more of a modern classic because it was published in the 60s. I really, really love this book. I gave it 5 stars. I still think about it occasionally, and I think it's even more masterfully done when you consider how young she was when she wrote this book. Number 25 is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Yes, I have read this. In fact, I just reread it in 2024. And I love it so much. It's not my very favorite Jane Austen, but it's definitely towards the top of the list. 24 is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I have read this and love it very, very much. And it's just amazing to me to see the progression of how we started with this masterpiece of literature and then how Frankenstein's monster is portrayed in media and cartoons and stuff like that nowadays. Number 23 is The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. This is one I want to read at some point. I used to always get this confused because H.G. Wells also has a book called The Invisible Man. And so for a really long time, I didn't know that there were 2 of these. So I want to read both of them. Actually, I'm getting ready to read H.G. Wells' Invisible Man very soon for the first time. Number 22 is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I love this book. It's been a really long time since I've read it, but it is definitely a deeply impactful book. Number 21 is The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. I was not forced to read this in high school, and so I had never read it, and I don't know that I really want to read it as an adult. I guess there's part of me that does, just because it was so widely chosen in high school curriculums, but also I am not really that interested. 20 is Don Quixote, and this is on my 40 by 40 list because I've attempted to read this once and DNF'd it about 40% of the way through, but I do want to complete it because this is another one of those iconic works of literature that has had long-lasting effects on culture over time. Number 19 is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, and I have read this one multiple times, and I love John Steinbeck's writing. Number 18 is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. I have not read this. It says that it's about World War II. I actually didn't know that. I don't know why, but I thought Catch-22 was like a sci-fi, which shows that I know absolutely nothing about this book, and so I should probably read it at some point. Number 17 is 100 Years of Solitude. So I was going to read this, and then I read some things about it that made me think I don't want to read it. So I would maybe like to try something else by this author, but I don't know that I want to read 100 Years of Solitude. If you've read it and enjoyed it, tell me why in the comments. Convince me that I should read this book other than the fact that it's a well-known classic. Number 16 is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. I have not read this, but this is on my classics TBR for this year, so I am going to read it this year, and I am so excited about that. It's interesting to me because I feel like so far we are about halfway through this list, and a lot of these are more modern classics that were published in like the 60s or later. There's a couple of older books on here, like Don Quixote, Jane Austen, Frankenstein. So there are some that are older, but a lot of these are much more modern classics. So I don't know if we're going to be getting into more older books. Like, I don't know if they're counting down to like the number one best, most must-read classic on this list, but I'll be interested to see if like the top half of this list has more older works of literature. Number 15 is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. I would not say that this is a classic. It was published in 1989, which means that this book is about the same age as me. That's 35 years old, which to me is not a classic. I feel like a classic needs to be older, although the book as a whole does feel older, and I have read it. Number 14 is My Antonia by Willa Cather. This was one of my top books of the year this year, so I'm really happy to see that on here. I really love Willa Cather. Number 13, Little Women by Louise May Alcott. I'm so glad this is on this list because, again, this is one that I feel like has really long-lasting effects on like storytelling and movies. There's even been like much more recent movies made of it and retellings of it all over the place. I love this book. It is one of my favorite books of all time. Brideshead Revisited. This is actually on my list of books I want to read because Evelyn Waugh, is it Waugh? Wow? I'm not sure how you pronounce that, is an author that Flannery O'Connor talked about a bunch in her letters that I have read some of. And so because she loved this author so much, it makes me want to read him. Number 11 is Lord of the Flies by William Golding, another book that is commonly assigned to kids or teens in school. My older sister actually read this book, I think in like 6th grade, and I think that this would be a very scarring book for a 6th grader. I didn't read it until I was an adult. And I have mixed feelings on it because I love it, but I don't because the writing is like so immersive and you feel like you're really there, but then you also feel like you're really there when it gets really brutal and really dark and really disturbing. But I think it's a really interesting conversation starter about human nature. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, another modern classic and another book that I am going to read this year. Next, we have The Color Purple by Alice Walker. Again, this was published in the 80s. So I don't know how I feel about books in the 80s counting as classics. And maybe that's because I was born in the 80s, but even so, like a book that is like 30 to 40 years old. I don't know. How would you define a classic? Because I feel like they're defining classics as like, these are books that have had like cultural impact in the United States or something like that. Because there's a lot of more modern American classics on this list, including The Color Purple. So I don't know. I have not read this yet. Number 8 is Robinson Crusoe. So that is not a modern classic. That one is quite old. I have read this. I read it out loud to my daughter, and I'm gonna be totally honest, like I think it has redeeming qualities and I understand why it's a classic, and there were elements to it that I loved, but I spent the majority of this book feeling very, very bored. Next, we have Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. There's not a lot of children's classics on this list. I think the only other one so far has been Little Women. Charlotte's Web, I have read this many times as a child and also read it aloud to my daughter several times when she was little. I love Charlotte's Web a whole lot. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. I would say this is probably more of a modern classic because it's published in it says 1950. I really love The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I love all of Narnia. Number 5, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I have read this in high school, and I hated it. And I have been wanting to reread it, but also kind of simultaneously nervous to reread it because I had such a visceral reaction to it as a high schooler. I've wanted to reread it to see if I have different thoughts as an adult, because I no longer need to read a book that feels entirely redemptive or has likable characters. And I think that that was much more important to me when I was younger than it is now. Number 4 is Middlemarch by George Eliot. I have read this. Actually, so far, I think it's my least favorite George Eliot, but it was still a 4-star book. It's one of those ones where I think I would enjoy it more upon a reread. I didn't love how it resolved, who our main character ended up with, because I thought that he didn't deserve her. So anyways, I did really enjoy Middlemarch overall though. Number 3 is The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. I have read this, and this is actually one that I kind of have a little bit of mixed feelings about, again, because of our main character, because of our narrator. And I still really loved so much about the book. It's just like, it's so well written that it makes me want to read some more Edith Wharton for sure. Number 2 is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Of course I've read The Hobbit. I actually have reread it the past 2 years in a row, and I do really love The Hobbit, but I love Lord of the Rings a whole bunch more. But I appreciate The Hobbit so very much and love so much about it. Number 1 is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. This was published in 1970, so again, a more modern classic, but a little less modern than the ones that were published in like 1980s. But still, I have not read any Toni Morrison. I feel like she is someone that I should read because she's impactful and she writes really deep stories. But I know that some of the subject matter and content that she includes in her books are things that I find particularly upsetting. I have a lot of friends that read The Bluest Eye in high school, and they told me a lot of the things that they read in it. Some of them really loved it, some of them really hated it, but there was some very like disturbing things in the book, which is unfortunately a reality for a lot of people. So it's one of those things where I feel like just because it's something that bothers me doesn't mean that it's not something that like it should still be written, so that way it's representative of things that really happen. But I have a really hard time reading books that have the kind of content that her books do. So if you know of any Toni Morrison books that are on the lower end in terms of like sexual abuse or things like that, that's the thing that I'm like the most bothered by in books. So if you know of some of her books that have less of that in it, would love to hear. Maybe The Bluest Eye is one of those because it is commonly assigned in high school. Well, that is the top 30 best classics that you must read according to Forbes, and I didn't do that great. I didn't keep count, but I'll put like the total of how many of these I read out of the 30 on the screen. I would love to hear from you in the comments down below. How many of these books have you read? How many of these books do you feel like should or shouldn't be there? Because again, when it comes to like how you define a classic, like, are some of these books too new to be here? Or are there books that are so influential that even though they're only like 30 years or 50 years old, they deserve to be called classics? I think this is one of those conversations where different people are going to fall on different sides of the conversation. So I'm really curious to hear what your thoughts are. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me. And I will see you again tomorrow with another of the 12 Days of Christmas.